Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. Today, our Executive Director, my good friend, I'm going to call you my good friend today instead of just my super cool boss, Chris Costa, is joined by another good friend, Darrell M. Blocker, former Deputy Director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. Hi, Daryl.
Hello.
Daryl is the Chief Operating Officer for MOSAIC Security, a strategic intelligence, crisis management, and executive advisory firm. He retired from government service after a successful 32-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, including 28 years as a CIA operative. Daryl is an ABC News national security analyst and contributor with expertise on North Korea, Iran, and terrorism, and more than he's letting on. He was awarded the CIA's Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal and was recognized as the most senior Black officer in CIA's Directorate of Operations when he retired in 2018. Daryl is developing espionage-themed content in Hollywood, serving as a TV consultant, and he volunteers with nonprofits dedicated to serving youth in the foster care system, and that is peaceforkids.org. Enough from me, over to you, Chris.
Amanda, thank you very much for the great introduction. As always, I must say that ever since Daryl and I did a segment with ABC together in the early days of the invasion of Ukraine, I said, we really have to get together. It was a great segment. I really enjoyed it. And Daryl's been a great friend of the museum, so it's really important that we're together today. I think we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. So I'd like to dive in with some of the stories that I'm focused on, because there's a lot happening besides Russia and Ukraine, although that is a critical and a significant national security story, to be sure. But I want to focus on some other things that are happening on the periphery and zero in on those stories. First and foremost, from a national security standpoint, Ellen Nakashima from Washington Post did an excellent article and some excellent reporting on China building another secret naval facility, secret in quotes, of course, in Cambodia. In this case, we have seen some other reporting of construction that stopped in the United Arab Emirate when the United States protested. Here again, we have China on the ground, apparently in Cambodia, building a Navy facility on Ream Naval Base. Apparently, Chinese have been wearing civilian clothes, have been very low profile as China builds a facility that will give them more access to the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, to be sure. So on top of a naval facility in Djibouti, on the other side of the world, in East Africa, this will be the second Chinese naval facility, but it really underscores this notion that China is very much interested in global competition, more force projection in the future, and oftentimes our audience asks us questions about the China threat. So I want to make sure I highlight that particular article. Secondly, changing gears a little bit. So the Director of National Intelligence here in the United States has directed a review to look at intelligence analysis. And I know Daryl was not just an operator, but at the same time, he also was an analyst at some point in his career. He might have something to say about this. But the United States is on the hook to really evaluate its analysis of Afghanistan, its analysis of capabilities and the will to fight of Ukrainians, because the United States intelligence community got it wrong on both scores. In other words, we underestimated the Ukrainians' will to fight, their capacity to fight, and we overestimated the Afghan national army, their will to fight, their capacity to fight. Why? So the DNI, and I applaud them at doing this, is doing a deep dive right now, and there's bipartisan support for this here in the United States to really assess the assessors, right? To look at the intelligence and understand how analysts drew those judgments. All right. I want to switch gears to counterintelligence and focus on China again. So this particular story really got my attention. So there's an indictment that was recently unsealed here in the United States. The indictment charged a Chinese American for espionage-related offenses as a result of his cooperation and concealment of that cooperation with Chinese intelligence officers, 4 named Chinese intelligence officers. This Chinese American lived in New York City. He put up a shingle and as an anti-democratic or a pro-democracy advocate for Chinese. That was merely, it seems like a front to really draw people in, Chinese and other dissidents, and then pass that intelligence back to China. In other words, the policy of repression that the Chinese government projects across the world carries over to here in the United States. And interestingly, 2 individuals that we've talked about in the past, the head of Department of Justice, their National Security Division, Matt Olson, commented on that particular case, and so didn't the FBI's Alan Kohler, the head of FBI's CI division. I think this is an important story, and that's why they went public. That's why the indictment was unsealed. The United States is not going to tolerate on our soil Chinese government going after dissidents. I think this is a really, really important story to watch and to follow. And just parenthetically, I think I've mentioned to this audience in the past, I had an opportunity to have a one-on-one fireside chat with Director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, out in Sedona, Arizona. And we talked about this policy of repression. And Director Wray spoke in the strongest terms of ensuring the FBI is zeroed in on that threat. All right, changing gears onto counterterrorism. You might remember those who join us each month for Spy Chat. Back in January, our first guest of the new year was Ali Nazari, who is the Afghan political advisor, the head of foreign relations for the National Resistance Front, the Panjshiris, the ethnic Tajiks that are ensconced north of Kabul in Afghanistan. Well, recently there were some articles from the Washington Post that revisited the Panjshiris to try to sort through what is happening on the ground between the resistance and the Taliban. It seems there have been some armed clashes. The Taliban continues to tamp down that reporting and invited the Washington Post to the Valley to see for themselves that it's relatively peaceful. On the other hand, the Panjshiris are saying that they are enjoying some success going after the Taliban operating in the Panjshir Valley. So this is a story we will continue to talk about in the following months, particularly as we continue to assess really what is happening on the ground in Afghanistan. All right, changing gears again, onto extremism. Clearly, extremism is in the media. It is a national security issue, not just here in the United States, but globally. And I'd like to take us to Germany for a second. Germany is significantly concerned with right-wing extremists, in particular working with the security services in the military, working with domestic police agencies, and also a part of the intelligence community in Germany. So they are redoubling their focus on identifying those extremists and trying to figure out how they can throw them out of positions of responsibility because of their far right ideology. So this is an important story to track. I think in the past 2 years, there have been some 327 cases that have been significantly concerning. And it's not just violent ideological underpinnings, if you will. It's also storing weapons and planning to attack government facilities as a result of their ideological leanings. So this is something we have to pay attention to, particularly here in the United States. But this is a trend in other places in Europe, as well as arguably here in the United States. All right, so the last two stories that I'm focused on are related to hostages and wrongful detentions. The first story I want to talk about is the Lebanese spy chief was here again in the United States, Major General Abbas Ibrahim, who I've met with virtually and talked about hostage-related issues. Abbas has come back from Lebanon. He was apparently invited in the last few months to come here to the United States, go to the White House, go to the NSC, the National Security Council compound, and engage in some discussions on ways to work on hostage release in Syria of some 6 hostages. There are only 2 that were made public in the article I'm referring to. That is a Washington Post article. One of them, of course, is Austin Tice, who has literally been held unacknowledged, I might add, by the Syrian government for the past decade. Abbas has enjoyed some success as a partner with the United States to be an honest broker and engage with the Syrians. That's a tough neighborhood. He has to traverse and navigate a lot of potential traps as the head of the Lebanese G2. And lastly, of course, I do want to close loop on Ukraine in terms of hostages. I think hostages and potential prisoners of war, so to speak, depending on how they're characterized. 2 Americans were rolled up on the battlefield. I would submit that they should enjoy the rights of the Geneva Convention as combatants. That is my assessment. That is my understanding of the law. As such, the Russians have a different interpretation, and they may very well charge them for some terrorism related offenses, which is significantly problematic for these 2 Americans, potentially 3. So that is a story in future spy chats we are going to track very closely. Of course, these are very different from wrongful detentions. These are individuals that were captured on a battlefield, but they are lawful combatants. And finally, my book recommendation for the month, I want to circle back to a book that we've talked about in the past. Certainly, we've done programs related to Virginia Hall, the intrepid resistance operator during the Second World War, a woman that was extremely courageous. We have her artifacts at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. The book that I read is by Sonia Purnell, A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of Virginia Hall and World War II's Most Dangerous Spy. I really enjoyed the narrative. It is highly readable. And why did I read it now? Because we've talked about resistance against Russia on the ground in Ukraine. I published an article in The Hill. We shared it with this audience. It is a relevant topic because it seems that guerrilla attacks have increased against Russians in in Russian occupied space in the Ukraine. So this is a story we should pay attention to in the months ahead. And I would argue that there are lots of women that are inextricably linked to this resistance in support roles as well as active combatants, I am sure. So that's a lot. I'd like to turn it over to Daryl and find out what he is tracking, and then we can open up to questions. Thanks, Daryl. Over to you.
Chris, that was fantastic. And all of those stories I've been tracking as well. But I would like to begin with Virginia Hall. I remember the first time in the hallways at the agency, and I did the iconic painting of her with the radio equipment in some barn in France was just captivating to me, because you don't really hear about the women. And the OSS period, of course, is one of my favorite periods of espionage. But when I read that book, man, it was fantastic. It is an absolute must read. And when people ask me about what it's like to be in the agency or what they should be reading, that is definitely at the top of the list of books that I talk about.
I'm going to voice of God and say I love the book too.
Good. Now, we all talked about my background. So of course, from the early days, I've been tracking North Korea. I still follow North Korea. I still follow Iran. The only country that I continue to track based on where I've actually served, because when you leave a place, you typically just you leave it behind. Pakistan got into my blood and it never went away. It is the AFPAC theater is relevant to what's going on in Russia, Ukraine right now. What happened in Kabul could be the same thing, the comparisons to Vietnam. We all talk about, intelligence and not learning from it. Well, Caleb and Joshua, who were sent by Moses out to spy what was awaiting them, were also not believed by the people. They turned against them. Everyone reported something different. So even intelligence back in the days of Moses was seen as suspect, as seen as something that was nefarious or evil. And I don't see it as that at all. Espionage is eye-opening. Espionage is one of those things that, whether you're a librarian or a historian, or whether you like guns, I mean, there's something in espionage for everyone. In terms of other stories that I'm tracking, I work for ABC News, so I have to keep abreast of everything that's going on. And I don't really have any particular one area of the world that I like more than other, but what I am, I guess, most concerned about is we hear about homegrown terrorists. And I studied and tracked terrorists from the first failed attempt by Al-Qaeda to take down the World Trade Center in early 1994, all the way until I retired in 2018. And the similarities between how Al-Qaeda and ISIS goes about identifying, immersing, indoctrinating, and launching terrorists, whether they're lone wolves, or whether it's somebody that's going to be driving a vehicle bomb into an area. They all use the same methodology that they use to recruit Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and the Klan and anyone else out there that I think would be absolutely moved into the terrorist side of the house. But we as a nation have an idea of what a terrorist should look like. And I think people have trouble associating that with Americans, even though one of the articles that Chris mentioned is about a woman who is a convert to Islam from the Midwest, from Mike Pompeo's backyard of Kansas. and she was probably one of the more virulent and aggressive and quite angry terrorists that are out there. So we need to start looking at one another, not spying on one another, just looking, like the people on the plane with the shoe bomber, who recognized and said, it wasn't security services that stopped that from happening. It was a concerned citizen. It was someone who looked at that and said, that doesn't seem right. Concerned citizens took down the underwear bomber. Concerned citizens stop things all the time. So that is intelligence. That is see something, say something. It works. But we as a nation are going to have to change our laws. As I understand it, there is no federal statutes or laws that define how they're going to deal with homegrown terrorists. Just take out the homegrown. They're terrorists. Just stay with that definition. The internet has changed the way people, identify, immerse, and indoctrinate folks. So that is my biggest concern: is it too late to stop some of these things? I don't think so. It's never too late. So yeah, I could go on about homegrown terrorists, but I think I think it's more important that I be prepared to answer questions. So Amanda, at any point, if you want to start with Q&A, we can do that. I think it's what the audience wants. I think it's what is probably more effective time for being able to respond to something, as opposed to just rattling on about what I like, because I like it all.
You like it all.
I like it
Okay,
all.
well then we'll go very wide ranging. Chris, do you have anything you want to ask him before I jump into these questions?
So I just want to provide some additional clarity on that the excellent reference that Daryl had. What the audience doesn't know is I decided not to talk about, for a lot of reasons, but no good reason, the ISIS woman that Daryl just identified. So I'm going to jump in there and fill the void, because I didn't talk about it today. But this is a really important case, and Daryl is exactly right. We tend to look at terrorists. We have a certain framing. We certainly didn't fully appreciate that someone that looked like Timothy McVeigh, these youthful looks, a kid that grew up in upstate New York, all of a sudden becomes a terrorist, does something that people in the Middle East, in Lebanon, for example, in the 70s was used to doing. Somebody from Hezbollah, a major bombing against a barracks of Marines and an embassy, and all of a sudden McVeigh puts the national security community on its heels. That said, today, there is now a trajectory and a trend for women to be far more violent and to be radicalizing exponentially greater than they ever have in the past. So the case is about a woman from Kansas named Allison Fluke Ekron, if I'm saying the name right, an American housewife that radicalized, went overseas, and led an ISIS battalion to conduct operations against the Syrian Democratic Forces and anybody else that got in her way. She just pled guilty in a court here in the United States in the Eastern District of Virginia. So Daryl's point is right on the mark. Terrorists come in all different shapes, sizes, colors. It's just something that we have to continue to watch. And the radicalization process is universal. So thanks for pointing that case out. So that's what I wanted to follow up on, Amanda.
Yeah, and we have our good friend Farhana Kazi, who did really early research into women's radicalization. And it was one of those things that, probably 15 years ago was blowing my mind, because we like to think of, I like to think of women as peaceful. So the reports don't always portray that as such. And this also brings to mind that youthful radicalization, Morton Storm, who's featured in our exhibitions in Spies and Spy Masters, who was kind of a bad boy in Denmark and then becomes radicalized in prison. Do you think, so I'll just jump in with this question on that path. Are there ways that the US should be protecting our youth? Because we know what a difficult time youth has had during the pandemic. And so kids are online, they're looking at materials. And I know we have some friends like Mubin Sheikh who are working online to keep people from radicalizing. Are there any government programs or intelligence programs that we should know about that could help with this, or is that out in left field?
There aren't any that I'm aware of, but if we, and I'm going to just use the Uvalde example, the brother approached the sister to purchase a gun, and she was like, absolutely not. She knew that there was something that her brother shouldn't have. So a family member knew. The grandmother obviously was probably trying to stop him, which is why she was shot first. And so there are always signs. It's rare. In fact, I can't think of any instance in which somebody just woke up and immediately went out and did something of this scale. He had to go out and purchase guns. The terrorists have to go out and look at their approach to, to a scenario. So it's never just A to B. There are always steps along the way. And people are afraid to report that their family members are having a hard time. There's a major global mental health crisis going on right now. And I think a large part of that is people are not listening to one another. People are not feeling, people are not appreciative of the fact that everyone is going through something and we all have different ways of coping. And some people are not better trained to cope. I thought that my background growing up overseas in a military family, being in the foreign service, whether it's AID or State Department or the agency, we lived in places where the water wasn't always available or clean, where electricity was going off and on, where there were strikes that shut down the government. I mean, this is something that I think prepared people like myself for the pandemic. So I think I was a little more, I guess, situated than most people who had never been under house arrest, who had never been restricted from traveling, who never thought about the fact that they couldn't hug their loved ones goodbye as they were dying in hospitals. That impact, that mental strain is going to take some time to get over. And people need to be patient. And families need to find in their local area how to report mental health issues. It's not a legal thing yet. It doesn't involve the police. Find a social worker in your circle. Find a mental health crisis, a line that you can call and say, hey, it's not me, but talk to someone, because there are ways to stop these things from happening.
Well, I want everyone to know we're going to get global, but we have some really interesting questions about domestic terrorism. So I'm going to follow that vein for a minute, and also just a question not strictly about domestic terrorism, but how is our divided situation in the US benefiting terrorists, which could be here, or terrorist states or terrorists abroad?
Well, first of all, our law enforcement intelligence services are stretched to gossamer thin. That's the first thing. Police are stressed too. Police have homes and family and have to protect not just their own family, but their job is to protect and serve. So I don't know. That's a tough question. It's I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, and Daryl's right, it is a tough question. And to be sure, the United States government right now, the counterterrorism enterprise is wrestling with the questions of how do you apportion resources to focus, scarce resources in many cases, to focus on domestic violent extremism, as well as still keep our eye on all of those women, for example. So 70,000 people were in camps radicalizing in Syria. Some number of those women and children are going to turn to terrorism. If they get to the West, if they're able to leave the region, we're vulnerable. So we have an international terrorism threat in terms of the United States, as well as a significant domestic violent extremism threat that we've been talking about for some time. So the current administration zeroed in on that. And in the early days of this administration, the Biden administration, they published a domestic violent extremism strategy. It actually shocked me at how quickly it was published. They're still the administration is still using the Trump administration's 2018 national counterterrorism strategy. So it was a sound strategy. I'd like to shout out, my previous colleagues, because I think it was a very, very rational approach to counterterrorism. But in short, to answer that question, it has to be balanced. We have to focus on the polarization here in the United States and the threat of actors turning into political violent actors here in the United States. And I think the FBI is very much focused on that threat, as well as law enforcement, but it's a lot. And we only have a finite amount of resources. So it's got to rely on some nonprofits that are in the space of counter-radicalization, as well as funding streams that go to getting kids off of the internet if they're going to bad sites. Some of those programs are in play. So that's a quick summary of how I see that problem.
Great, great. Well, I'm going to switch gears a little bit over to Ukraine. Is Putin just trying to take down the US economy through invasion of Ukraine, or does he really just want the territory? And this guest would like some speculation from you.
I think the Putin has not been shy about what his intentions are. This is not anything new. Since 2014, when they rolled into Crimea and Donbass, there's always been the threat of them trying to take more of Ukraine. I don't think this war is going to take down our economy. It's going to take down the Russian economy, which is roughly the size of Italy. So think about that. The Italian economy and the Russian economy are roughly the same. They can't win an economic battle with the United States. It's an impossibility. But they're not just fighting the United States. The entire world has coalesced against them. Corporate America. We have hacktivists that are out there. We have 90%, 98%, if you count the 35 that are staying, were against this war. I'm not really concerned about Russia and the support that it has from North Korea, Syria, Belarus, and Eritrea were the four yes votes that they got in the United Nations back in late February or early March. So no, I don't think it's designed to take down the US economy. No, I don't think a war is going to be able to do that. Can we sustain a two-front war? I think we can. My background from birth, born into the military family and served as an intelligence officer in the Air Force, we're prepared. Do we get it right every time? No, of course, no one gets it right every time. But I think America needs to understand that trained professionals who study this, literally go to work every day to just study this one issue. We're not just talking opinions based on reading the New York Times or, the foreign press or anything like that. This is what we do on a daily. This is what we feel on a daily. And I trust that we get it right more often than we don't get it right, because the world only sees when we make a mistake. They don't see all the successes. That's what I see. That's what I focus on. And on the terrorist thing, we need to stop demonizing everyone. Demonizing someone clouds your approach, clouds your ability to make reasoned and objective choices and decisions. Now that I'm out in the corporate world, everybody says, oh, you're a Democrat or you're this. And I'm like, no, I've always been middle of the road. I've worked for 6 presidents, 4 Republican, 2 Democrat. Didn't matter to me who was in the office, Reagan to Trump. That was my career. The 80s was fascinating from intelligence perspective. The 90s was, for me, was heaven, because that's when I was a young case officer running around the world. But I don't think the world is inherently more dangerous than it was. I think the United Nations and talking works. In the early days, everybody was early days of the Russian invasion, that is. Said, but the UN, all they're doing is talking. Yes, but that talking stopped World War III from happening for 80 years. Let's talk. If you're talking, you're less killing going on. I'm always for talking.
Yeah, and Daryl did a great job really of addressing that question. I would just add on the point of economy, and I'm not an economist, but I don't think economy in terms of affecting the United States was factored whatsoever in Putin's designs. This is purely self-focused. He's self-absorbed. He is a revisionist. He is trying to go back and restore what he thought was lost from the former Soviet Union. We've talked about that a lot. And I should mention that in July, we're going to have Malcolm Nance join us. He is on the ground right now in Ukraine, so he'll be able to give us, literally, we'll have a live segment, some flavor for his points of view and how others view the questions that our audience will have, and what those perspectives are from Ukrainians and those individuals he's working with. But I think this is all about there have been some comparisons to St. Peter the Great, restoring what was an empire. But of course, this is self-defeating as well. And from an economic standpoint, what I can say is Putin is only hurting his own economy. So I'll leave it at that. Excellent question, though.
We've got a ton of questions. Do you believe that U.S. allied intelligence overestimated the capabilities of the Russian military in the past, as demonstrated in Ukraine?
I don't know where that argument keeps coming from. I don't think we underestimated them at all. The Russian, I'm dating myself. The Russians have not fought a ground battle since Afghanistan. And I'm not talking about what they were doing in Syria, which was, of course, military, but it didn't have the eyes of the world on it as it does right now, and what they're doing in the Ukraine. So these are great questions. That's why I like talking to people that I know are intelligence professionals, or people who are interested in it, because it makes you think. I do not think we underestimated the Soviets' capability or the Ukrainian resolve, because I'm telling you, there is an analyst somewhere in the IC who correctly predicted it, and at some point discussions were held. We didn't get it wrong. We did not get it wrong. Putin got it wrong. Putin underestimated the world's response. Everything that he wanted not to happen is now happened. Finland, Sweden, wanting to join NATO, the EU wanting to fast track the Ukraine, the world literally coalescing against them, McDonald's, I mean, you just name it, everybody's pulling out. Not from the Russian people. I need the Russian people to understand that this is not against them. This is against your leader. And you have the capability of removing that leader at the ballot box. Maybe, because I think he changed the Constitution. But the point is, this change is going to have to come internally. If it's done externally, I think that exacerbates and gives Putin the ability to maybe do some moves that he wouldn't otherwise do. But the world needs to stay together, and the people within Russia need to speak up. And there are a lot of people speaking up. Sabotage, the woman that held up the little placard on their news, they're debating it on television. It's not like the Russian people aren't talking about this. They're not hearing the full truth of what's going on. But in today's world, where everyone has one of these, everyone has the capability of near real time, or actually real time, from multiple angles, capturing exactly what is happening and what's not happening. Their ability to use disinformation has pretty much gone away. And if you look at Zelensky, President Zelensky spent the entirety of his life in front of the camera, his adult life. As an actor, as a comedian, he is completely comfortable with the world looking at him, talking about him. Vladimir Putin has spent his entire career in the shadows. He doesn't want, of course, he's been the president, he's been the prime minister, and now he's the president again. But he's not used to the world seeing the shenanigans that he's trying to do, and the spotlight just keeps moving, and he can't get out of the spotlight, which is a good thing for us. Keep him in the spotlight. The longer we keep him in the spotlight, the less options and chances he'll have. And eventually he's going to have to make the decision. He could stop the war today. He won't, but we need to give him an out, whatever that out is. And I'm confident there are probably multiple scenarios out there where people are working this issue, trying to get him to the negotiating table, so to speak. But I'm hopeful, but some people think I'm too hopeful.
We like hope around these parts. I'm really interested in hearing what you both, and especially Daryl, have to say about this question. How will the African continent be involved, if at all, regarding Ukraine? Russia's, the Russian struggle, especially given China's growing foothold on African land by various means. And Daryl, I know you have been boots on the ground there, so really fascinated about this.
I think that what's going on, the impact right now is mostly the food crisis. It's impacting the entire world, and clearly the African continent is being impacted by the fact that grain isn't getting out of the Ukraine, it's not leaving ports, and all those other things. So I think this is an exciting time. When I joined the agency in 1990, the war in the Congo and Savimbi, all of that was coming to a close. But that was old world, the eagle versus the bear, choose one side or the other. Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, was probably one of the more ingenious African leaders when he was caught between the United States and Russia. And he says, we look neither east nor west, we look forward. And that was his way of signaling to the United States and to whichever, Russian president at the time, to say, we want to make our own path. We'll have American friends, we'll have Russian friends. All the African leaders are going to need to do that. I don't think China's foothold in Africa is as solid as it might appear. just based on the fact that they have a base in Djibouti. I know they had expansionist ideas in Ghana. They're pretty much in every African country. I've never seen a stadium on the African continent that wasn't built by the Chinese. So them getting land, they can't sustain it or maintain it. That land is still going to be in Namibia, in Ghana, in Djibouti, in wherever they happen to be. So I think the fact that the United States has hundreds, in fact, I think 700 something bases around the world. China has 2, Djibouti, and the other one is escaping me right now. What is the intent of their expansions in Africa? Resources, just like the Belgian Congo, just like the way it's always been. You name it, it's always been about the resources on the African continent. Their economies are growing at an amazing rate. It's a great investment opportunity. And why wouldn't China invest there? But I don't see them as a long-term threat on the continent. The African countries can be quite fickle in who they decide to back.
Just 2 quick points to follow up on that question. Daryl knows the continent a lot better than I do. I have experience on the ground in the Horn of Africa, been to Somalia, been to Djibouti, been to Ethiopia. All of that said, I really appreciated that Zelensky called out some African countries this week and said, to Daryl's point, this war is impacting your food situation, scarcity of food. It's going to impact you. Africa, you need to speak up. You need to put some pressure on Russia. So that's on one level. Africa has to come to the table. I think African countries on the continent need to understand that in time, this could impact the entire world. It already is in terms of supply chains. That said, my greater concern, I've said this before, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I am far more concerned about instability, insurgencies that are breaking out and growing on the continent in Africa, and where local insurgent groups are picking up the branding from ISIS and rebranding and posing a threat to the governments. Or in the case of Mali, Mali says, we're going to invite private military organizations, in effect, mercenaries from Russia, and you can come here and do our bidding. And of course, Russians are killing a lot of innocent civilians on the ground in Mali under the guise of a counterterrorism mission. So these are the things that are going to play out in the continent. But as Daryl knows, these kinds of different and very specific, more localized fighting took place throughout the continent of Africa during the Cold War. So just different actors, but the same themes, the same playbook. There's going to be problems on the continent.
While we are talking about Africa, and I never shout out where Chris has been because he's told me some things that I'm not supposed to know, so I never place you anywhere, Chris. So thanks for that list. Now I know things that I can say, but Chris just recently wrote a piece that impacts this question. What are your thoughts on Al-Shabab's Islamic insurgency in Somalia? And I know you have a lot of thoughts about that, Chris.
Yeah, I can tackle this one first, give Daryl a break for a second, and just say that the United States reversed a policy that in the final days of the Trump administration was changed, and that was U.S. boots on the ground in Somalia were pulled out. And the idea was that was part of this track that we're not going to have endless wars. Even though I served in the administration, being very objective, because that was always my intent, to offer the best advice that I could from a policy option standpoint, I really preferred that U.S. forces, a small footprint, stayed on the ground and worked with our Somali partners, the Danab. And when the Biden administration, again, being objective, when they reversed the policy and put boots back on the ground in Somalia to work with our foreign partners, I applauded those efforts. And I published an article with Tom Warwick, just making the point that I thought the administration did what was right. So we call it as we see it. As Daryl said, we're not politicos. My perspective is working with foreign partners with a small footprint comes with risks. We risk American special operators, and I'm very, very wary of that, wary as well, because I know people, we both know people that have been lost in the Horn of Africa, Americans. So it comes with risk, but I think we have to continue, the West has to continue to put pressure. And I should say, we work with the United States works with the African Union. So I think that was the right policy change for the Horn of Africa in particular.
And I'll just add to that, that I was a very young case officer. In fact, I might have been the youngest case officer. I begged my boss for 4 months to send me out to Mogadishu in the aftermath of the of Black Hawk Down. Eventually got out there, and it was such a different perspective than any other place I had ever been. But Al-Shabab only knows how to destroy. They don't know how to govern. They don't know how to build up. They don't have an answer for how they're going to deal with things. And I will say that when I was chief of Africa Division, the Somalis were some of our best partners. The Somali service, they were really good. I'm talking men, women, young, old. We worked with the African Union in terms of helping them, and having boots on the ground in the eyes of most people in the United States means, oh my God, we're sending in the 82nd Airborne, or we're sending in, you know, an occupying force. Boots on the ground from the perspective of clandestinity could be an agency officer along with someone seconded from the Department of Defense, who is basically an advise and assist. When you invest in doing that, it shows our partners that, okay, this isn't our fight. And they don't want it to be our fight either. They actually want to fight and win this war on their own, but they recognize that they need assistance. So I'm glad that that was reversed. If we're going to pull boots out of the ground in every place that we're concerned, we're in trouble as a nation. It only works because of the ties that we have, the constantly going to Kenya, constantly talking to Ukrainians, constantly talking to all of our partners on the daily basis, out of embassies, out of conference exchanges, out of training. All of that might seem frivolous, but when something like the Ukraine invasion happens, now you already have those relationships established. And now you can go to 193 other countries and say, okay, this is what we need. And they don't have to ask who you are, because they know who you are. They've been dealing with you on the daily, and quite frankly, for many, many decades, all the way back to, back since 1945 forward.
Looking to Nicaragua now, do you have any views on our policy towards Russian troops sending folks there for training? Do we have any policy about how we feel about Russians training in our near neighborhood?
Just like the US sends out troops to train foreign partners, the Russians do that as well. The Russians being in Nicaragua is nothing new. They've been there for a long time. Now, if we start to see an increase in material, in supply, in personnel, then that's what we call an indications and warning. And yes, then you start to look at it a little more closely. But the fact that they've got Russian forces training Nicaraguans, well, that's, again, I think it's always been, the world chose one side or the other. Most were with the Russians, the Soviets, the Warsaw Pact, or they were with the Americans, with a few people on the like the Swiss, and we're neutral, or we don't want to be a part of this big battle between these big beasts. So yeah, I could go on, but I know there's other questions.
I would just add, great power competition is playing out on the ground in Nicaragua and El Salvador in particular, and that's got garnered attention, at least on my part. And I've written some on El Salvador and transnational gangs. I think those are the bigger issues: transnational gangs destabilizing countries, thriving democracy like El Salvador that prided itself on the transitions to becoming more democratic. It seems now that President Bukele of El Salvador is trending toward a more authoritarian position. He's reaching out to the Chinese, he's reaching out presumably to the Russians as well. So this is troubling, but as Daryl said, this is nothing new to us. That what might be new is the fact that the United States is, I don't want to say distracted, because the United States can do more than one thing, but we're focused on Ukraine. We're concerned about terrorism, again, domestic violent extremism here in the United States, but at the same time, we're not focusing a lot of attention on Central America. There was just some kind of meeting on the West Coast, and some of those nations are angry. Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, to name a few, are angry with the United States, a summit, if you will. So they're demonstrating that by being no-shows. That's, I think, from a diplomatic standpoint, that's a problem for those countries in the long term, because the United States is trying to balance a lot of these issues, and it is our backyard as well, the United States. So it's something we should really pay attention to. But thanks for the question.
Yep.
We have one, this is probably our last question, unfortunately, but it's from one of our favorite people. Daryl, we have a very young lady who, like, you see Chris grinning because we have a very young and very avid Spy Chat watcher who always has great questions. And today she wants to know, she saw that the DHS bulletin was updated on June 7th to a highlighted alert status for upcoming dynamic disturbances, and it's set to expire on November 30th. And she wants to know what goes into changing the alert status, and how do they come up with an expiration date? And I am now super curious about this myself.
May I ask how old this viewer is? Because that's a fantastic question.
It is.
What is she? Is she 14 now, okay, Chris?
I think she is a little younger than 14. Wow. But I hope I'm not mistaken.
Well, she was really young when she first, like 12, but I realized the pandemic's been going on a long time.
2 years has ensued. That's right.
She might be 14. Maybe she'll oh no, she's 17. I'm receiving from my, so the pandemic has apparently been 5 years long, and we were sleeping through some of it, Chris.
Listen, I'm going to answer this quickly. That was a fantastic question. I think each department determines, is this a 30, 60, 90 days? And it's because it's a DHS, it's DH offices from, they're looking at what's been collected abroad. They're looking at other intelligence and then kind of factoring that in. But that is a agency by agency decision, and what goes into it is driven by what's happening on the ground at any given time. And you can follow things, and then of course this fire breaks out over here, which means you got to You got to put some resources or turn your attention to that. But we are watching everything, as Chris mentioned, and I think we do it well as a community, and everybody seems to want to use the pre 9/11 paradigm for talking about how the agencies don't cooperate or collaborate with one another. That has not been my last 20 years in the business. It is as collaborative as ever. And so that bulletin, to answer your question, that's an internal decision process that's made there. Why November was chosen, I can't give you an idea without knowing what the substance of those bulletins are. But those are just to highlight to all the other receivers of that information, the stakeholders, that, oh, okay, this changed from the last time we received this. And that's really the only thing, because it might be the same 6 stories with, one or 2 things change within them. That's what analysts are doing on the daily. They are tracking things and making sure that they are providing their policymakers, their folks with the most accurate, comprehensive, and timely information that they can possibly provide on that day in time.
Yeah, and all I would add is I was a customer of the DHS bulletins. I would read them with great interest. That complemented the decision-making at the White House, at the National Security Council, but that was very much a DHS product that has been created to ensure the widest dissemination, which is why you, Rose, I still am stunned, and I apologize that time has gone on since COVID. I don't know. So we forgot to add those years onto your age, your chronological age, and I apologize. But all of that said, it's a great question, but that was a lot of sausage making that happened at the department level, but I was a customer too. But the whole idea as a result of that paradigm from 9/11 was to disseminate this information, to get it out to the federal law enforcement community, to get it out to the public. I would submit that the bulletin probably is very much linked to the election cycles, because polarization on top of elections, on top of the current hearings related to January 6th, all that is factored into it. Now, there's a lot of hyperbole and there's a lot of hysterics on the possibility of a really rough summer. I don't know if that's true or not, because I'm not seeing the intelligence, but a lot of things are lining up that demonstrates that there are vulnerabilities across the nation as a result of this cycle. So I think you are well attuned to going to the right resources so you can read those materials and judge for yourself and keep coming to Spy Chat.
I like that plug. I like that plug, Chris. I cannot thank you both enough for so many candid and thoughtful answers. Our guests are really appreciative. There were so many questions we didn't get to, and I apologize for that. But I do want to tell you our next public program, virtual, is another Spy Chat. It is coming up fast. Chris gave you a teaser. That is going to be Malcolm Nance coming to us from Ukraine on July 7th at noon. So I hope you will be here for that. We have all sorts of cool programs and some in person now. So check out our website to sign up for those, for adults, for youth, for families. And any final words before we close this down, dear gentlemen?
I just wanted to say thank you once again. I went to the old International Spy Museum, and then when I got a chance to go to the new one, and I met you, and I love espionage. I love everything about the craft. I love that people are actually talking about it. And I think the more people who understand the process and what goes into it, and I think the Spy Museum is just genius, and always a fan. And I appreciate this opportunity to hang out with friends and talk to hundreds of people. You can find me on LinkedIn. If your question didn't get answered, track me down on LinkedIn. I will answer your question.
Wow, that is so kind and generous. Boss, any final words?
I can not possibly top that. Just my gratitude to our spy team and Daryl. This was a lot of fun. I will say that the ABC interviewer that Kira Phillips had
Yeah.
said we were the dream team. I don't know if that's true, but I really appreciated the compliment publicly from Kira at ABC. They're lucky to have you as a contributor, Daryl. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks, everyone.
And Daryl has contributed his time. And if you would like to contribute to the Spy Museum, we would sure appreciate that. That's how we do programs like this for free for you. We count on donors all year round. So if you feel generous, please make a contribution. We sure appreciate you being here. And everyone, we'll see you soon. Stay well, stay dry if it's wet or humid, and enjoy. Summer started. Bye, everyone.